If you were ever born, then you have already experienced one of the strangest events imaginable. You woke up, not from sleep, but into existence itself. At some point, in the darkness of early development, matter began organizing itself in a very unusual way. Neurons fired, signals spread, sensations emerged, muscles moved. Awareness slowly assembled itself from living tissue. Somewhere along that process came the first flicker of experience. The first moment there was something it felt like to be you. And from that moment on, consciousness never truly left. You learned to recognize faces, to understand language, to see yourself in a mirror, and realize that the person looking back was somehow the same person experiencing thoughts behind the eyes. You developed preferences, fears, desires, memories, dreams. You became a mind observing itself, which is a deeply strange thing for matter to be doing. Consciousness feels almost unnatural when examined closely. Atoms become awareness. Chemistry becomes emotion. Electrical signals become grief, wonder, nostalgia, embarrassment, love. Somehow, a collection of cells develops a preference for pleasure over pain, imagines futures that do not yet exist, remembers places that no longer exist, and spends its quietest moments wondering why any of this is happening at all. Who is it that experiences a dream? What exactly is a thought? Why does the universe contain things that can ask questions about the universe? For thousands of years, people have tried to answer those questions. Ancient traditions across the world often arrived at surprisingly similar observations, despite being separated by oceans, languages, and centuries. Many believed that ordinary consciousness was only a small part of a deeper reality. In Buddhist traditions, the self was often described as less permanent than it appears. Certain Hindu philosophies viewed consciousness as fundamental to existence itself. Ancient Greek thinkers wondered whether the mind was discovering reality or creating part of it. Different conclusions emerged, but the same mystery remained. Something about awareness seemed too strange to ignore. Modern science approaches the problem differently. Instead of meditation, myth, or philosophy, it uses experiments, brain scans, mathematics, and observation. Yet despite all our technology, many of the deepest questions remain surprisingly open. Scientists can measure electrical activity inside the brain with extraordinary precision, but explaining why that activity feels like anything from the inside is another challenge entirely. And perhaps that is why consciousness remains so fascinating. It is the one mystery you cannot step outside of. Every observation you make, every memory you revisit, every idea you consider in the hours ahead will happen inside the very phenomenon we are trying to understand. Tonight, we'll explore some of the strangest things we've discovered about the human mind. Not just facts about the brain, but observations that challenge how we think about memory, perception, identity, dreams, emotion, and the experience of being conscious at all. Because the deeper we look into the mind, the less ordinary it becomes, and the stranger it begins to feel that anything is experiencing reality in the first place. And before we begin, for the quality of your sleep, this video has been made with dim, low-light visuals, slow movement, and a soft, calm voice. Nothing here is meant to tug you awake. You can listen closely or let the details drift by. If you would like, you can leave your own interesting fact with the hour this found you, the general part of the world you are listening from, or what the room feels like tonight. I genuinely like seeing how far these quiet little subjects travel. If this kind of slow documentary helps, subscribing tells me you want more of 100 strange facts about the human mind and keeps the channel going without making the night any louder. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The brain uses about 20% of the body's energy, despite accounting for only a small fraction of its weight. Quietly, constantly, it burns through fuel faster than almost anything else inside you. Even now, even with the lights low and the room still. Most people imagine thought as something clean, a sentence arriving intact, a decision appearing all at once. But underneath that smooth surface is an amount of activity so dense it becomes difficult to picture without shrinking it into something ordinary. An old desk drawer works well enough. Not the organized kind, the kind that sticks halfway open. Tangled charging cords, dead batteries, receipts folded into soft little squares, a pen that stopped working years ago, but never quite got thrown away. You reach in for one thing and end up dragging half the drawer with it. The brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons. Tiny living cells passing signals back and forth in patterns so complicated that even modern scans only catch fragments of the traffic. Each neuron can connect to thousands of others. Not neatly, not efficiently, more like an ancient city built on top of itself over centuries. Wires crossing wires, pathways bending around older pathways, no one fully removed. And somehow, from inside all that clutter, your thoughts feel singular. You wake up believing there is one continuous you moving cleanly through the world. But under the surface, countless signals are competing, rerouting, suppressing, reinforcing. The machinery is crowded, restless, busy in ways your conscious mind is never allowed to fully witness. That may be the strangest part. The brain hides its own labor from you. You are never aware of the staggering amount of filtering happening every second just to create the feeling of a stable reality. Your mind edits vision before you consciously see it. It predicts words before people finish speaking. It removes unnecessary details, smooths over gaps, reconstructs missing information, adjusts emotional meaning, suppresses distractions, rewrites memories while recalling them, all before you notice anything at all. Most of the work is invisible. Sometimes you can feel the edges of it though. Walking into a room and forgetting why you entered. A familiar name refusing to arrive for several long seconds. Solving a problem hours later in the shower after giving up entirely. Remembering something embarrassing from 10 years ago with perfect emotional clarity while forgetting what you ate yesterday. The drawer catches sometimes. Signals move through the brain through tiny gaps called synapses, where chemicals leap from one neuron to another, in microscopic exchanges of electricity and chemistry. Fast enough to feel instant, slow enough that your nervous system still operates more like weather than machinery. And every brain is slightly different. The broad architecture stays recognizable, but the exact wiring changes across a lifetime. Experience reshapes connections constantly. Repetition strengthens pathways. Neglect weakens them. Grief changes the brain. Loneliness changes it. Exhaustion does too. Even now, while listening, your neurons are subtly reorganizing around what holds your attention and what fades away. You are not using a finished object. You are using something that is continuously rebuilding itself. There's a strange comfort in that, also something slightly unsettling, because the mind often feels permanent when it really isn't. Even the numbers begin to lose meaning after a while. Billions of neurons. Trillions of connections. More possible pathways than there are stars scattered across the Milky Way. And yet most days this impossible structure is occupied with ordinary things. Finding keys, replaying conversations, craving sleep, searching for the right word that seems to hover just beyond reach. Maybe that is why the brain feels so mysterious. Not because it behaves like a machine, but because it doesn't. It improvises. It compensates. It guesses. It fills empty spaces without asking permission. And somehow, out of all that tangled, invisible activity, a conscious life emerges at all, which raises another strange problem entirely. Because once signals begin moving through a system this crowded, this tangled, this electrically alive, how does any thought arrive fast enough to feel immediate? Chapter 2. A green walk signal flickers on above a wet intersection. For a moment, nobody moves. The city holds still in that peculiar late-night way, where headlights smear across the pavement, and every sound seems slightly farther away than it should. Then someone steps forward. Maybe you. Maybe the person beside you. Either way, the strange part has already happened before the movement becomes visible. The signal left the brain first. Some nerve impulses travel at speeds approaching 170 miles per hour. Not thoughts in the poetic sense, not memories or dreams, but the electrical commands that move muscles, shift balance, tighten tendons. Pull your foot off the curb before you consciously feel the decision arrive. That speed is one of the quiet miracles keeping ordinary life intact. Without it, people would drop glasses constantly. Catching a falling object would become almost impossible. Crossing busy streets would feel delayed and dangerous. Even conversation would change. Facial reactions would lag behind emotion, just enough to make everyone seem subtly disconnected from themselves. Instead, the nervous system hides the delay so well that consciousness feels immediate. But it isn't. That's the unsettling part waiting underneath this chapter. The feeling of deciding something and the physical process itself are not perfectly synchronized. In many situations, your body begins preparing actions before your conscious mind fully catches up. By the time you feel yourself choosing to step forward, signals are already moving through the nervous system, like traffic released after a red light. You experience the result as intention. The machinery experiences it as timing. Inside the body, the process is strangely mechanical for something that feels so personal. Electrical impulses move along neurons through exchanges of sodium and potassium ions. Tiny charged particles shifting across cell membranes in carefully controlled waves. Some nerves are wrapped in fatty insulation called myelin, which helps signals travel dramatically faster, almost like coating electrical wires to reduce interference. Without that insulation, the system slows. Some signals move quickly enough to feel instantaneous, others crawl. Pain, oddly enough, often travels more slowly than reflexes. That's why you can touch something dangerously hot and pull your hand away before the conscious feeling of pain fully arrives. For a fraction of a second, the body reacts before the mind finishes narrating the event. The story catches up afterward, and most people never notice how often this happens. A city intersection reveals it well, because crossing a street feels simple while actually involving thousands of tiny calculations unfolding beneath awareness. Your eyes scan movement automatically. Your hearing sorts engine noise from footsteps. Your balance adjusts against uneven pavement. Your brain predicts trajectories constantly, estimating speed, distance, risk, intention. All of this happens silently. You don't experience the computations themselves. You only experience the finished sensation. Safe, unsafe, go, wait, move now. Consciousness receives the summary, not the raw processing. Sometimes the illusion breaks a little. Fatigue slows reaction time in ways people underestimate. A poor night of sleep can make the world feel half a second farther away. Exhaustion changes driving ability, emotional control, attention span, even moral judgment. The machinery still runs, but less smoothly. Signals hesitate. Focus drifts. Thoughts feel heavier, crossing the distance from impulse to action. Most people know the sensation without realizing what they're noticing. Standing still after the light changes. Forgetting what you meant to say halfway through a sentence. Reaching for something and knocking it over instead. Trying to react quickly while your mind feels wrapped in fog. The traffic jams. And despite all the speed involved, the brain itself remains strangely quiet about its own operation. You never feel electricity moving through your nerves. There's no sensation of signals racing beneath the skin. The system conceals its complexity behind the smooth experience of simply being alive. That concealment may be one of the mind's greatest tricks. Because if you could consciously feel every calculation, every correction, every delayed impulse and predictive adjustment happening underneath perception, ordinary life would probably become unbearable. The brain edits out its own labor the same way cities bury electrical systems beneath the street. You only notice the machinery when something flickers. A missed step. A delayed reaction. A moment where the body feels temporarily disconnected from intention. And even then, the system improvises remarkably well. Habit helps. Repetition helps. The nervous system strengthens commonly used pathways over time, carving familiar routes through the brain, the way repeated footsteps wear shortcuts through grass. Actions practiced enough eventually begin slipping beneath conscious attention almost entirely. driving familiar roads, typing passwords, walking home at night while thinking about something else entirely. The mind automates what it can, not because consciousness is efficient, but because conscious attention is expensive. That may be why so much of life feels partially automatic in retrospect. The brain is constantly trying to conserve effort, predicting patterns before they finish unfolding, simplifying reality into manageable pieces, turning repetition into instinct whenever possible. And still, despite all this speed, all this prediction, all this hidden coordination, the system remains fragile. A little exhaustion changes everything. A little fear changes perception. A little distraction at the wrong moment can rearrange an entire life, which makes the ordinary act of crossing a street feel stranger the longer you sit with it. The light changes. Your foot lifts. Signals leap invisibly through darkness beneath the skin. And a decision that felt conscious may have begun moving before you ever heard yourself think it. Chapter 3. Most people imagine mental exhaustion as something dramatic. A breakdown, a collapse, a visible burnout. But more often it arrives quietly at a breakfast table. A half-drunk mug of coffee going cold beside a grocery list. The strange difficulty of remembering whether you already replied to an email. Reading the same sentence 3 times because the words refuse to settle into meaning. Standing in the kitchen with the refrigerator open and no clear memory of what you were looking for in the first place. The brain is expensive. That may be one of the least appreciated facts about being human. Despite making up only a small percentage of the body's weight, the brain consumes roughly 20% of the body's energy. Pound for pound, almost nothing else inside you demands so much fuel so consistently. Even now, with your body still and the room quiet, your nervous system is burning through calories just to maintain the ordinary feeling of being conscious. And strangely, most of that energy is not being spent on intelligence. Not really. The majority goes toward maintenance, keeping neurons electrically charged, preserving communication between cells, recycling chemicals, regulating internal balance, filtering sensory information, predicting movement, maintaining body temperature, quietly updating your model of reality moment by moment without ever asking for recognition. The mind spends enormous resources creating the illusion that things are effortless. That's why mental fatigue feels so strange sometimes. You can become deeply exhausted without doing anything that appears physically demanding at all. Hours of decisions, social interaction, stress, uncertainty, emotional restraint, concentration, background anxiety. The body often treats these invisible efforts as real biological labor, because they are. The brain does not particularly care whether the threat is a predator or an inbox. Stress still costs energy. So does self-control. So does pretending to be okay when you aren't. There's something oddly comforting about that. Mental exhaustion can feel abstract until you remember the body is paying for every thought in chemistry, and the brain is not especially efficient about it. That becomes obvious on mornings when fuel runs low. Skipping meals, poor sleep, dehydration, prolonged stress. Suddenly, the machinery becomes easier to notice. Words arrive slower. Patience shortens. Small tasks begin feeling strangely heavy. You reread messages without absorbing them. Simple decisions develop unnecessary friction. The grocery list starts looking vaguely hostile. A drop in blood sugar doesn't usually create cinematic collapse. It creates fog. A softer, duller version of reality, where concentration becomes expensive and motivation begins quietly negotiating against itself. Most people know the feeling intimately. The strange thing is how quickly thought changes once the body senses limited resources. The brain becomes conservative. Attention narrows. Emotional regulation weakens. Annoyances feel larger than they did an hour earlier. Tiny inconveniences acquire emotional weight they probably don't deserve. You become less patient with the world because the system is trying to spend less energy navigating it. And still, even in exhaustion, the brain protects itself aggressively. If food becomes scarce, the body starts making compromises elsewhere first. Muscles weaken, hands grow colder, physical energy drops, but the brain continues demanding fuel with remarkable stubbornness. Consciousness, as fragile as it feels emotionally, is treated by the body like priority infrastructure. The lights dim around the building before the control room goes dark. That image becomes stranger at night, because sleep is not the shutdown most people imagine. The body rests, but the brain continues working through enormous amounts of activity beneath awareness. Memories reorganize. Emotional experiences get processed and sorted. Important information strengthens. Used details weaken. Waste products clear through microscopic cleaning systems that become more active during deep sleep. Certain regions of the brain grow quieter, while others become intensely active, especially during dreaming. In some ways, the night shift never ends. Dreams themselves are expensive little productions. Entire emotional landscapes assembled out of electrical activity, while the body lies motionless in darkness. Conversations with people who are not there, places that do not exist. Fear, nostalgia, embarrassment, grief, all generated internally by an organ floating silently in fluid behind your eyes. And somehow this process is considered rest. There's an irony hidden inside modern life, because many people now spend enormous portions of their energy budget on invisible psychological strain rather than physical survival. Notifications, financial anxiety, constant decision-making, social performance, information overload, doom scrolling late into the night while already exhausted. The nervous system evolved for immediate physical environments, not endless abstraction, not 20 unfinished tabs open inside the mind at once. Maybe that is part of why modern fatigue feels so difficult to explain. People often assume exhaustion must be earned physically to be legitimate. But the brain doesn't separate mental effort from biological effort nearly as cleanly as culture does. Thinking is physical. Worry is physical. Attention is physical. Even imagination leaves traces in the body. And despite all the measurements, scans, and metabolic studies, there is still something unresolved underneath this subject. Scientists understand where much of the energy goes, but the deeper mystery remains strangely intact. Why does subjective consciousness require so much fuel at all? Why should awareness itself be this metabolically expensive? No one has a complete answer. Only the evidence. The coffee cooling beside your hand. The fatigue that arrives from invisible labor. The strange heaviness of trying to think clearly after too little sleep. And the realization that even during your quietest moments, your mind is still consuming enormous resources simply to keep the experience of being you running continuously through the dark. Chapter 4. Laundry rooms feel strangely detached from time at night. A single overhead bulb, the slow churn of water behind circular glass, warm fabric piled in uneven towers beside a machine that hums with the patience of something built entirely around repetition. Wash, pause, spin, pause again. Sleep follows a rhythm like that. People often imagine dreaming as a continuous state, as though the mind slips into another world for 8 uninterrupted hours and returns sometime near morning. But dreams arrive in waves. Long stretches of the night pass in relative quiet before the machinery shifts and another cycle begins turning beneath the surface. The brain does not dream steadily. It pulses. Roughly 90 minutes after falling asleep, the first major REM cycle begins. REM stands for rapid eye movement, named after the small flickering motions visible beneath closed eyelids, while the rest of the body remains almost completely still. During these periods, brain activity rises sharply. Certain regions become nearly as active as they are during waking life. Emotion centers brighten. Visual areas ignite. The nervous system starts constructing impossible places with absolute confidence. Then the cycle fades again. The strange part is how uneven the night becomes after that. Early REM periods are brief, sometimes lasting only a few minutes before deeper sleep returns. But as the hours pass, the dream cycles stretch longer and longer, until the final REM periods near morning can continue for nearly an hour at a time, which means many of the dreams people remember best happen close to waking, when the mind is spending more time suspended between sleep and consciousness. That may explain why morning dreams often feel unusually emotional. Not necessarily logical, just emotionally dense. A hallway from childhood appears beside a stranger's apartment. Someone long gone speaks with perfect familiarity. A conversation unfolds that feels deeply important until the instant you wake and realize none of the words can be recovered. The brain accepts these impossible transitions effortlessly while dreaming, as though coherence matters less than emotional momentum. And somehow, during all this, the body stays mostly paralyzed. That detail still feels slightly unsettling, no matter how often it's explained. During REM sleep, the brain temporarily suppresses most muscle activity, likely to prevent people from physically acting out dreams. In other words, while the mind wanders through entire emotional realities, the body lies motionless in darkness, beside a pile of unfolded laundry, or a dim digital clock, blinking unreadable numbers across the room. Consciousness leaves. The body waits. There's something quietly eerie about that arrangement. especially because dreams themselves are so fragile. Most vanish almost immediately after waking. People often lose them while reaching for a glass of water or pulling on socks in the pale light of morning. A dream can feel emotionally enormous 1 second and become completely inaccessible the next, dissolving with a speed that feels disproportionate to how real it seemed moments earlier. You are left with fragments. A staircase. A face. A feeling of urgency with no surviving explanation. The mind spends part of every night generating experiences it often refuses to preserve. No one fully understands why. There are theories, of course. Dreams appear connected to emotional processing, memory consolidation, learning, fear rehearsal, creativity. Some researchers believe dreaming helps the brain sort important information from unimportant information, strengthening certain neural connections while weakening others. Others suspect dreams may partially function as simulations, allowing the mind to rehearse danger, social conflict, or uncertainty safely inside imagined environments. But the deeper purpose remains unresolved, which makes dreaming feel strangely intimate and mechanical at the same time. Electrical activity, chemical regulation, memory sorting, and somewhere inside all of it, intensely human experiences unfolding without witnesses. A surprising amount of emotional life happens there. People revisit old relationships in dreams years after forgetting them consciously. Anxiety resurfaces disguised as architecture. Regret appears as missed trains or locked doors or endless searching. Sometimes the brain combines ordinary details so convincingly that waking up feels briefly disappointing, as though reality itself became the lesser version. And unlike ordinary thought, dreams rarely obey stable narrative rules. Time collapses. Identity shifts. Locations merge together. The mind accepts contradictions effortlessly, while sleeping that would feel absurd in daylight. That may be because dreaming reveals something uncomfortable about consciousness itself. The brain does not naturally prioritize truth as much as coherence. If the emotional logic works, the mind allows the rest to bend around it, which may not only be true during sleep. There's a softer comfort hidden underneath all this too. Every culture humans have ever built seems to have noticed dreams lingering at the edges of meaning. Ancient sleep journals, morning storytelling rituals, superstitions about recurring symbols, quiet breakfast conversations about strange places visited overnight. People have always suspected dreams mattered somehow, even when they couldn't explain why. Maybe because dreams expose how active the mind remains beneath awareness. Even in complete darkness, consciousness keeps moving through cycles of memory, emotion, fear, imagination, rehearsal, association. The machinery never truly stops. It only changes rhythm. Like a washing machine turning steadily in another room while the house sleeps around it. And perhaps the strangest part is how quickly the night erases itself. You can sit at the edge of the bed trying to hold on to the final image before it slips away entirely. For a moment it almost returns. A sentence. A face. A place that felt painfully real seconds ago. Then nothing. only the faint emotional residue remains, and somewhere beneath that fading silence, the next cycle is already beginning to turn again. Chapter 5. The fattiest organ. The human brain is soft enough to deform under its own weight. That sounds less like a scientific fact and more like something overheard in a dim anatomy lab at 2 in the morning. But it's true. Removed from the skull and its surrounding fluid, the brain begins to slump almost immediately, folding inward with a texture often compared to softened butter, chilled tofu, or custard left out too long on a kitchen counter. Which is strange to think about, considering this fragile object generates every thought you have ever trusted. The brain is composed of nearly 60% fat by dry weight, making it the fattiest organ in the body. Not metaphorically, literally. More than muscle, more than the liver, more than anything else hidden beneath the skin. Most people carry around the equivalent of an electrically active butter dish protected inside a shell of bone. And despite how absurd that sounds, the fat is not excess. It is infrastructure. Neurons need insulation. Electrical signals traveling through the nervous system weaken if the pathways are exposed or inefficient. So the brain wraps many neural fibers in fatty sheaths called myelin. These layers act almost like biological insulation around electrical wiring, helping signals move faster, cleaner, more reliably through the tangled architecture of the nervous system. Your thoughts depend partly on grease. That detail alone feels slightly unbelievable, especially because consciousness feels so crisp from the inside. Ideas arrive with sharp edges. Emotions feel immediate. Memory feels solid while you are inside it. Yet underneath all of that clarity is a physical structure, delicate enough to bruise, wrinkle, swell, bleed, or soften from changes most people never notice happening. A sudden stop in a moving car, a missed step, a collision on wet pavement. The brain is resilient in some ways and alarmingly fragile in others, which may explain why the skull exists less like armor and more like careful packaging around something biologically irreplaceable. Bone, fluid, membranes, layers of protection built around tissue so soft that surgeons sometimes compare touching it to handling cold fruit or dense cream. And strangely, the brain itself cannot feel pain directly. That fact unsettles people every time they hear it. The organ responsible for generating the experience of pain contains no pain receptors of its own. Headaches come from surrounding structures, blood vessels, muscles, nerves, pressure against membranes. But the tissue itself remains silent, which creates the peculiar reality that the thing producing your entire sensory world exists in darkness, without sensation. An organ trapped inside experience, but unable to experience itself directly. There's something philosophically uncomfortable about that. The fatty structure of the brain also reveals how biologically expensive thought really is. Myelin is not decorative material. Losing it changes everything. Diseases that damage myelin can slow movement, blur coordination, interrupt speech, weaken memory, distort sensation. Signals that once traveled smoothly begin stuttering across damaged pathways like electricity through frayed wires. The mind becomes less fluid when its insulation breaks down. And despite decades of research, scientists still do not completely understand why certain brains maintain these systems more effectively than others. Diet matters somewhat. Genetics matter. Sleep matters. Stress appears to matter more than people once realized, but the relationship between nutrition and cognition remains tangled in 1,000 overlapping variables, which is disappointing in a strangely human way. People want the brain to behave like a machine with simple instructions. Eat this, avoid that. Improve cognition in 3 easy steps. But biology rarely offers clean bargains. The brain is less like a computer and more like a living ecosystem built out of unstable chemistry, electrical timing, accumulated memory, emotional conditioning, microscopic repair systems, inherited vulnerabilities, and billions of constantly changing connections suspended inside fatty tissue, delicate enough to dent under pressure. And somehow, from within all that softness, emerges personality, humor, grief, music, embarrassment, the memory of a voice you have not heard in years. That contrast may be why facts about the brain feel uniquely intimate compared to facts about other organs. Learning how the liver works rarely changes your sense of self. Learning that your thoughts depend on vulnerable fatty insulation hidden inside darkness feels different somehow. More personal, more precarious. There's also something oddly comforting hidden inside the messiness of it all. The brain is not engineered with sterile perfection. It leaks signals occasionally, misfires, compensates, rewires around damage when it can, improvises constantly. Even memory itself is partly reconstructive and unstable, rebuilt each time it is recalled rather than perfectly replayed. The machinery survives through adaptation more than precision, which feels strangely similar to human life itself. And maybe that is why the kitchen imagery lingers around this subject so naturally. Butter dishes, bread knives, warm counters under low light, domestic objects carrying quiet fragility inside ordinary rooms. Because the brain does not feel like some distant machine buried in abstraction. It feels close, soft, vulnerable in ways people spend most of their lives trying not to think about directly, until exhaustion arrives, or injury, or one strange moment where a familiar word disappears temporarily from reach and suddenly the physical reality underneath thought becomes impossible to ignore. The mind feels permanent while you are inside it, but permanence is not really what the brain offers. It offers continuity through maintenance, through insulation, through endless biological repair happening silently beneath awareness every second you remain alive. And somewhere inside that soft electrical darkness, your entire sense of reality continues flickering forward, delicate and stubborn at the same time. Chapter 6. Awake on the table. There is something deeply unsettling about the fact that the brain cannot feel pain, not emotionally, physically. The organ responsible for every sensation you have ever experienced exists in complete silence regarding its own injury. You can feel a paper cut, a headache, a splinter under the skin. But the tissue generating those experiences remains strangely numb to itself, which creates one of the strangest scenes in modern medicine. A person lying awake while surgeons operate directly on the machinery of their mind. A hospital operating room at night has its own atmosphere. Stainless steel trays, folded blue sheets, monitors blinking softly in the dimness. The faint, antiseptic smell that seems permanently embedded in surgical hallways. Somewhere beneath all the equipment and fluorescent light is a person trying very hard to remain calm, while strangers carefully expose the organ, producing their entire sense of reality. And sometimes, during these procedures, the patient talks. Not because medicine has failed, because conversation is part of the surgery. The scalp and skull contain pain receptors, so those areas must still be numbed carefully. But once surgeons reach the brain itself, something strange happens. The patient can remain conscious while parts of the tissue are touched, stimulated, mapped, or removed. Doctors may ask them to count backward, name objects, move fingers, read sentences aloud. If speech falters, a region may be too important to disturb. If a memory surfaces unexpectedly, the electrical stimulation may have brushed against networks tied to emotional storage. The operating room becomes less like a mechanical repair shop and more like a conversation happening inside someone's identity. That's difficult to picture clearly the first time you hear it. Someone lying still, while another person gently touches the surface of their brain and asks, "What are you feeling now?" And sometimes the answers are surprisingly ordinary. A strange smell, a forgotten song, sudden déjà vu, an emotion with no obvious source, laughter, confusion. The medical literature is filled with moments that sound almost dreamlike when removed from clinical language. Tiny fragments of personality surfacing unexpectedly under electrical stimulation, as though parts of memory remain quietly waiting beneath ordinary awareness until disturbed directly. The deeper strangeness is what this reveals about consciousness itself. Most people imagine the self as unified, stable, centralized somewhere behind the eyes. But awake brain surgery exposes how distributed the experience of being you really is. Language lives partly here, emotional regulation somewhere else, movement elsewhere, facial recognition, spatial awareness, memory retrieval, impulse control. The personality people experience as singular emerges from systems scattered across fragile tissue, folded tightly together inside darkness. And none of it feels pain directly. That detail almost sounds like an error in biological paperwork. The body built alarm systems into skin, muscle, joints, teeth, blood vessels, nearly everywhere vulnerable. But the organ most necessary for interpreting danger receives no direct warning system of its own. Instead, the brain relies on layers of protection surrounding it. Bone, fluid, membranes, distance from the outside world. Evolution apparently decided that if something reached the brain itself, the situation was already serious enough without adding pain receptors to the tissue directly. There's something oddly cold about that logic. The body protects consciousness pragmatically, not emotionally. And yet people often respond to this fact with unexpected comfort. Maybe because it creates the feeling that some hidden center of the self exists beyond suffering. But that interpretation feels slightly misleading. The brain may not physically hurt when touched, yet it remains extraordinarily vulnerable in every other sense. Tiny chemical imbalances alter mood. Sleep deprivation changes perception. Inflammation changes cognition. Stress reshapes neural pathways over time. A small clot in the wrong location can erase language permanently. The machinery is silent, but not invulnerable. If anything, the silence makes it stranger. There's also something deeply human about the atmosphere surrounding awake brain surgery itself. Popular media often portrays it as a terrifying spectacle, but real operating rooms are usually quieter than people expect. Long pauses, soft instructions, careful observation. The patient trying not to move, while the surgical team watches for changes measured in hesitations, forgotten words, altered reactions. The entire procedure depends on preserving the fragile continuity of someone's inner world. Which means surgeons are not merely protecting tissue. They are protecting the ability to recognize loved ones, to remember childhood, to understand music, to speak naturally, to remain recognizable to oneself afterward. And perhaps that is why these procedures linger in people's minds so strongly. Awake brain surgery forces an uncomfortable realization into the open. The self is physical, not metaphorically, literally physical. Memories, humor, fears, habits, personality traits, all dependent on living tissue, delicate enough to bruise under pressure, and quiet enough to remain painless while being touched. That contradiction feels almost impossible at first. The most intimate parts of consciousness emerging from something so soft, so electrically unstable, so vulnerable to chemistry and timing. And still, despite all this fragility, the system usually holds together remarkably well. People wake up, speak normally, recover, return home carrying little more than exhaustion, a scar beneath their hair, and the surreal memory of hearing doctors talk while their own brain sat exposed beneath operating lights. Some even describe feeling oddly detached from the experience afterward, as though the mind struggles to fully process the fact that it briefly observed its own machinery from the inside. Maybe that's because consciousness was never designed to see itself clearly, only to continue. And somewhere beneath all the careful medical language and surgical precision, that mystery remains untouched. The brain can generate pain, fear, grief, memory, love, identity, entire imagined worlds, while remaining permanently incapable of feeling its own surface directly. Chapter 7. There is a particular kind of thinking that only happens in waiting rooms. Not productive thinking, not deep, philosophical thinking, just restless mental drifting. A plastic chair under fluorescent light. A wall clock ticking slightly louder than necessary. Old magazines nobody truly wants to read. Somewhere nearby, a printer hums. A phone rings once. Someone coughs into their sleeve. And inside, nearly every person sitting there, an invisible flood of thought keeps moving continuously beneath the stillness. The strange thing is how difficult it becomes to notice until you try. Most people assume they are thinking deliberately most of the time, but when psychologists began studying spontaneous thought more carefully, they discovered something unsettling. Much of the mind operates like background weather rather than intentional narration. Thoughts appear automatically, overlap each other, repeat themselves, dissolve halfway through formation, then quietly return hours later, wearing slightly different emotional clothing. The mind rarely stays empty for long. Even now, while listening, thoughts are probably moving underneath the narration itself. Tiny reactions, memories, associations, judgments, fragments of unrelated worries briefly surfacing before disappearing again. The brain layers experience continuously, often without permission, and no one has ever managed to count thoughts precisely. People have tried. Researchers asked participants to press buttons whenever a new thought appeared, or track mental shifts with counters and self-reporting methods. The results became messy, almost immediately, because thoughts refused to behave like separate objects. One idea bleeds into another. Emotions blur into memory. Mental images interrupt language. A single worry can mutate into 10 variations before you consciously recognize the pattern. Trying to count thoughts is a little like trying to count waves while standing in the ocean. By the time you identify one clearly, 3 more have already arrived. Still, the estimates became strangely revealing. Some studies suggest humans experience tens of thousands of thoughts per day, though the exact number matters less than the broader realization underneath it. Much of your mental life repeats itself constantly. The brain loops. Old conversations replay with microscopic edits. Future scenarios rehearse themselves automatically. Unresolved embarrassment resurfaces years later without warning. Grocery lists return while trying to fall asleep. Imaginary arguments unfold in the shower. Familiar anxieties circle back, wearing different disguises. A surprising amount of consciousness is recursive. That may be why silence sometimes feels uncomfortable. The external world quiets down enough for the internal traffic to become audible again. People often discover this accidentally the first time they sit alone without distraction for too long. The mind does not become peaceful immediately. It becomes loud. Thoughts arrive faster once attention turns toward them, almost like children suddenly performing after realizing someone is watching. Meditation teachers noticed this centuries ago. The goal was never really to stop thoughts entirely. That tends to make them multiply, but to observe them without immediately climbing inside each one. Easier in theory than in practice, because many thoughts barely feel like thoughts at all. They feel like reality itself while they are happening. A passing insecurity can temporarily reshape an entire afternoon. A remembered criticism changes posture without being noticed consciously. A single anxious idea alters how neutral facial expressions appear. The brain does not merely generate thoughts, it generates emotional atmospheres, and people often mistake those atmospheres for objective truth. That becomes especially obvious in waiting rooms, airports, sleepless nights, long showers, traffic jams, environments where external stimulation weakens just enough for the mind to begin wandering more freely. Underneath ordinary boredom sits an astonishing amount of invisible activity. Plans, fantasies, regrets, mental rehearsals, tiny self-corrections, songs repeating against your will for reasons nobody fully understands. The soundtrack inside consciousness is rarely under complete control. There's something strangely comforting about that too, because most people secretly suspect their minds are unusually chaotic until they realize nearly everyone is carrying around some version of the same internal crowd. Behind every calm face in a waiting room is a private stream of unfinished thought moving continuously beneath the surface. Someone worrying about medical results. Someone replaying an awkward conversation from 6 years ago. Someone mentally reorganizing tomorrow morning before it even arrives. Human beings spend enormous portions of life elsewhere mentally, while remaining physically still. And oddly enough, that drifting appears useful sometimes. Mind wandering has been linked to creativity, memory consolidation, emotional processing, future planning. Some problems become easier precisely when attention loosens its grip slightly. Solutions emerge unexpectedly while walking, showering, folding laundry, staring absent-mindedly through windows. The brain keeps working in the background even when consciousness appears idle, which raises a strange possibility. Many of your most important mental processes may happen outside deliberate awareness altogether. The conscious mind may be less like a ruler, issuing commands, and more like a spokesperson arriving late to explain decisions already underway elsewhere. That idea unsettles people for obvious reasons. Most of us want to believe we are fully authoring our thoughts in real time, but much of cognition feels increasingly automatic the closer scientists examine it. Associations form before conscious recognition. Emotional reactions appear before explanation. Certain thoughts surface, not because you chose them intentionally, but because the nervous system connected one internal pattern to another beneath awareness. The mind thinks constantly. The self notices selectively. And maybe that is why counting thoughts feels impossible in the end. The moment you begin observing the mind directly, you realize consciousness is not a clean sequence of separate ideas at all. It is weather, motion, overlapping currents moving through each other continuously while the brain tries to maintain the comforting illusion of a stable narrator somewhere at the center. Meanwhile, the clock keeps ticking softly above the waiting room chairs. Someone turns a page in an old magazine. A name gets called at the front desk. And inside every silent person in the room, another invisible wave of thought has already begun forming before the previous one fully disappeared. Chapter 8. Emotional Files in the Archive. There are memories that disappear almost immediately. What you ate 3 Tuesdays ago. The third person in line at a grocery store. Most of the faces that passed you on sidewalks this month. And then there are memories that remain alive for years with almost offensive clarity. A humiliating comment in middle school. a phone call in the middle of the night, the exact feeling in the room before terrible news arrived. Certain moments do not simply get remembered, they get marked. Deep inside the brain sits a small almond-shaped structure called the amygdala, a name that sounds softer than the work it performs. Buried beneath the outer layers of thought and language, it helps determine which experiences deserve emotional priority. Not logically important, emotionally important, which often turns out to matter far more to the nervous system. The amygdala is less like a historian and more like an emergency archivist working late into the night. Most moments pass quietly into storage, but some receive bright red tags before they disappear. Pay attention to this. Do not forget this feeling. Something about this mattered. The strange thing is that the brain does not care very much whether the emotion was pleasant or painful. Awe gets tagged. Terror does too. So does embarrassment, grief, desire, humiliation, nostalgia, panic, sudden joy. The nervous system prioritizes intensity more than morality. Emotion acts like highlighter ink across memory. That's why certain smells can unlock entire forgotten periods of life instantly. Burned toast suddenly becomes childhood anxiety. Chlorine becomes summer afternoons from 15 years ago. A particular perfume resurrects someone you haven't spoken to in years with such immediacy that the emotional reaction arrives before conscious recognition catches up. For a few seconds, the past stops feeling past, and much of that emotional reopening involves the amygdala interacting with memory systems deeper in the brain. The process is not especially careful. That may be the uncomfortable part. People often assume emotionally vivid memories must also be accurate memories, but emotion strengthens intensity more reliably than precision. Under stress, the brain becomes biased towards survival-relevant impressions rather than objective recording. The emotional tone survives. Certain details sharpen unnaturally. Others disappear completely. Trauma reveals this brutally. Someone may forget exact sequences, dates, conversations, entire sections of an event, yet still carry the emotional atmosphere intact for decades afterward. A loud sound triggers panic before conscious thought arrives. A certain street corner suddenly feels dangerous without obvious explanation. The body remembers faster than language does. The amygdala files feelings aggressively, even when the story itself becomes fragmented, and sometimes it overreacts. A single frightening event can stain unrelated experiences afterward. One humiliating public mistake, and suddenly ordinary social situations begin carrying traces of danger. The nervous system generalizes quickly because evolution favored caution over accuracy. Better to overreact occasionally than miss something threatening completely. The body would rather embarrass you than fail to protect you, which explains a surprising amount about human behavior. The amygdala also helps explain why people replay emotional memories involuntarily at night. The brain keeps reopening unresolved files, scanning them repeatedly, as though searching for a safer ending, hidden somewhere inside the details. That's why embarrassing moments return at 2 a.m. with absurd clarity, while ordinary happy afternoons dissolve quietly into the background. Emotional intensity creates stronger retrieval pathways. The nervous system keeps accessible what it suspects may matter again later. Unfortunately, the brain defines important very strangely sometimes. A minor social rejection can linger longer than entire peaceful years. One sentence said in anger survives untouched, while hundreds of kind conversations fade. A childhood humiliation remains emotionally active long after the room itself no longer exists. The archive is uneven and deeply human because of it. Scientists studying emotional memory sometimes observe this process through brain imaging or electrical recordings. When subjects recall emotionally charged experiences, activity often surges through the amygdala and connected regions involved in memory, threat detection, and bodily response. The body reacts alongside the memory itself. Heart rate changes. Muscles tighten slightly. Stress hormones shift. The brain does not fully distinguish between vividly remembered emotion and immediate emotion as cleanly as people imagine. Remembering can partially become reliving. That may explain why nostalgia feels warm physically, why grief can return instantly after years of dormancy, why certain songs seem capable of reopening entire emotional landscapes within seconds. Memory is not stored passively. It remains biologically active. And strangely enough, people with damage to the amygdala often describe the world differently afterward. Fear recognition weakens. Certain social cues become harder to interpret. Emotional urgency softens. Some researchers describe these patients as calmer in specific ways, but also more vulnerable. Without emotional tagging systems functioning normally, danger itself becomes harder to prioritize correctly, which reveals something uncomfortable. Anxiety, embarrassment, fear, emotional pain. These are not design flaws accidentally attached to consciousness. They are part of the navigation system. Imperfect, exhausting sometimes, but functional. The brain survives partly by remembering what hurt, and perhaps that is why emotionally charged memories feel so alive compared to ordinary time. They are not stored in the archive quietly beside everything else. They remain half open in the filing cabinet, waiting near the surface, ready to flood the room again if touched in the right way. A smell, a sentence, a song through a distant wall at night. Suddenly, the nervous system pulls the folder open before you consciously choose to revisit it. And for a moment, the past returns carrying all its original emotional weather intact. Chapter 9. Plasticity. The mind is not finished. That may be one of the most quietly important facts about being human. People often imagine the brain as something solidified over time, like concrete drying into permanence. Personality becomes fixed. Habits settle. The wiring hardens. But the nervous system never fully stops changing. Even now, while listening, tiny adjustments are happening beneath awareness. Connections strengthening slightly, others weakening through disuse. Entire patterns shifting in response to repetition, emotion, stress, attention, memory. The brain is less like a completed machine and more like a repair shop that never closes. A cluttered workbench explains it better than most diagrams do. Loose screws in shallow trays, bent springs, dust gathering in the corners around old tools, a clock partially disassembled under warm yellow light, while someone quietly tries to make it tick again without fully understanding why it stopped in the first place. Plasticity is the name scientists give to the brain's ability to reorganize itself. The word sounds technical, but the reality is strangely human. Learning changes the brain physically. Practice changes it. Injury changes it. Loneliness changes it. Love does too. Repetition carves pathways deeper. Neglect allows others to fade. Experience leaves marks on living tissue. Not metaphorically, literally. Every time you repeat a skill, certain neural pathways become easier to travel. Signals move more efficiently along familiar routes, almost like trails worn into grass after enough footsteps pass through the same place. That's why actions once requiring enormous concentration eventually become automatic. Driving familiar roads, typing passwords without looking, playing piano while thinking about something else entirely. The brain conserves effort whenever it can. And because of plasticity, repetition gradually reshapes what feels natural. That process becomes most visible when something breaks. Stroke patients relearning speech, injured hands slowly regaining coordination, someone recovering balance after damage deep inside the nervous system. The brain begins improvising around missing pathways, rerouting functions through neighboring regions where possible, building awkward detours through surviving tissue. Not elegant repairs, functional ones. That distinction matters. The nervous system rarely restores itself perfectly. It compensates, adapts unevenly, finds workarounds. Much of recovery involves teaching the brain new patterns rather than restoring old ones exactly as they were before. There's something strangely hopeful about that. Also something sad. Because plasticity reveals both the resilience and fragility of identity at the same time. The self feels continuous, partly because the brain keeps repairing continuity behind the scenes constantly. But the same flexibility that allows growth also means the mind can be reshaped by fear, trauma, addiction, isolation, repetition, environments, relationships. The brain learns from whatever it experiences repeatedly, whether helpful or harmful. That may explain why habits become difficult to escape. Repetition does not merely strengthen behavior psychologically, it strengthens pathways biologically. Anxiety practices anxiety. Anger rehearses anger. Shame deepens familiar roots through thought until certain emotional reactions begin feeling automatic and inevitable. The brain becomes efficient at whatever it repeats most often, even suffering. And yet plasticity also allows people to slowly move away from old versions of themselves. New environments alter behavior. Different friendships activate different emotional patterns. Therapy changes neural responses gradually over time. Skills once impossible become ordinary through enough repetition. The repair shop keeps working long after most people assume construction ended. Sometimes the rewiring becomes stranger. People missing limbs occasionally report feeling sensations in fingers that no longer exist. A touch near the face triggers the illusion of movement in a vanished hand. The brain's internal maps reorganize imperfectly after injury, reassigning territory in ways that reveal how fluid bodily perception actually is. The nervous system does not simply record reality, it negotiates it. And occasionally, the negotiations become confused. Scientists still argue about the limits of plasticity because the process refuses to behave consistently. Children's brains reorganize more rapidly in many ways, especially during certain developmental windows where language, movement, and sensory systems remain unusually flexible. Adult brains change too, though often more slowly and with greater resistance. Older minds can still learn. They just tend to renegotiate rather than rebuild from scratch. That feels true emotionally as well as biologically. People rarely transform all at once. More often, they accumulate small repairs over years. A fear weakens slightly. A grief softens around the edges. A healthier habit becomes less effortful. A painful memory stops triggering the same emotional flood it once did. The changes are gradual enough to feel invisible while they are happening. Then one day you notice you reacted differently than you would have 5 years ago, and realize the structure changed quietly underneath you. There's a comforting imperfection to all this. The brain is not engineered toward flawless optimization. It carries scars, old pathways, temporary fixes layered over older fixes, emotional habits inherited from childhood environments no longer present, strengths developed accidentally through repetition, weaknesses reinforced without permission. A lifetime of repairs stacked unevenly together, which may be why people remain psychologically unfinished for so long. The nervous system evolved to adapt continuously because the world itself keeps changing. Stability comes not from becoming fixed, but from remaining flexible enough to survive new conditions repeatedly. The mind survives through revision, and perhaps that is why memory feels so strange sometimes, why forgotten songs suddenly return intact after decades, why old fears can reactivate instantly, why certain habits disappear so slowly despite conscious effort. The repair shop never truly stops reorganizing the shelves. Even now, while you listen, your brain is altering itself slightly around these words, strengthening some connections, ignoring others, quietly deciding what deserves to remain after the night passes. And somewhere beneath conscious awareness, another small repair has already begun before you noticed anything changing at all. Chapter 10. Sense and Sensibility. Smell rarely asks for attention. Vision dominates rooms. Sound interrupts silence. Touch demands immediate reaction. But smell moves differently. Quieter, older somehow. It drifts through the background of ordinary life, shaping emotion before language fully catches up. And the human brain can distinguish an astonishing number of scents, possibly over 1 trillion. That number sounds exaggerated at first, because most people experience smell as vague rather than detailed. We name colors easily, We describe music with confidence, but scent often resists language completely. You recognize the smell of rain on warm pavement instantly, while struggling to explain it beyond. Rain, dust, summer, something metallic. The experience arrives intact. The vocabulary arrives broken. A crowded market early in the morning reveals this better than almost anywhere else. Steam rising from kettles. Torn citrus skins releasing sharp bitterness into the air. Crushed herbs beneath people's shoes. Wet cardboard. Soap. Garlic. Damp fabric. Coffee drifting from somewhere unseen. Human beings move through enormous clouds of chemical information constantly, without consciously noticing most of it. The nose begins interpreting the world before the eyes finish adjusting. And strangely, smell takes one of the shortest routes into emotion the brain possesses. When scent molecules enter the nose, they bind to specialized receptors that send signals toward regions deeply connected to memory and emotional processing. Unlike many other senses, smell bypasses some of the brain's usual filtering systems and reaches older emotional circuitry with unusual directness, which may explain why scent can resurrect the past so violently. A forgotten shampoo suddenly becomes childhood. A certain laundry detergent reopens an old apartment. Cigarette smoke through cold air becomes someone you haven't seen in years. The emotional reaction often arrives before recognition itself. For one brief moment, the nervous system remembers faster than the conscious mind does. That may be why smell feels strangely haunting compared to other senses. Memories attached to scent often carry less narrative and more atmosphere. You may not remember exact conversations or dates, but the emotional texture returns intact. Humidity, fear, warmth, loneliness, safety, the feeling of summer ending, the sensation of sitting in the back seat of a car at night, while adults talked quietly in the front. The archive opens all at once, and most of this happens below language. People consistently struggle to describe smells precisely because the brain processes scent differently than more verbal forms of perception. Smell feels immediate and emotional rather than analytical. You recognize thousands of odors effortlessly, while lacking the vocabulary to explain almost any of them in detail. That gap creates an odd loneliness around scent memories. You can miss a smell intensely, while barely being able to describe what is missing. There's also something deeply ancient about the system itself. Smell evolved early because survival depended on rapid chemical interpretation of the environment. Fire, rotting food, rain coming before it arrived visibly, illness, dangerous animals, human closeness. The nervous system learned to attach emotion to scent because emotion creates faster decisions. Safe, unsafe, familiar. Avoid this. Move toward this. Much of human life still runs quietly on those ancient evaluations. A bakery can improve someone's mood before they consciously notice why. Hospitals carry emotional weight partly through smell alone. Old books, sunscreen, pine trees, gasoline after rain. Certain odors seem capable of bending time more effectively than photographs. And unlike visual memories, scent memories often feel unfinished somehow, more immersive, less observed. Smell does not simply remind people of the past. It briefly returns them there. That emotional immediacy can also become painful. The nervous system does not carefully curate what gets attached to scent. Grief becomes linked to certain rooms. Anxiety attaches itself to antiseptic smells, or old perfumes or damp winter air. The body forms associations automatically, then reactivates them years later without asking permission. The mind stores emotional chemistry in places language cannot fully reach. There's an irony hidden inside the trillion scents statistic too. Human beings possess extraordinary sensitivity to odor, while consciously ignoring most smells almost all the time. The brain filters relentlessly. If it didn't, daily life would become overwhelming. Imagine consciously processing every trace of detergent, dust, skin, coffee, asphalt, fabric, food, moisture, paper, grass, smoke, electricity, and metal surrounding you constantly. So the nervous system edits. It suppresses familiar smells after prolonged exposure. That's why people stop noticing their own homes after a while. Why perfumes fade from awareness minutes after being applied. Why entering someone else's house reveals scents invisible to the people living there. The brain conserves attention by allowing familiarity to disappear, which feels strangely symbolic beyond smell itself. People adapt emotionally to environments the same way. Habits become invisible. Background stress fades into normality. Certain sadnesses stop announcing themselves loudly after enough repetition. Consciousness edits continuity together by ignoring what remains constant too long. And yet scent still slips through the filters occasionally. A passing stranger wearing something familiar. A hallway carrying the smell of old carpet and dry heat. An orange being peeled somewhere nearby. Suddenly, memory arrives before thought. Not as story, as feeling. Maybe that is why smell feels so tied to longing. It bypasses explanation and moves directly into emotional territory, the way dreams sometimes do. Quietly, instantly, without asking whether you wanted to revisit what it found there. And somewhere beneath all the ordinary air moving through your lungs tonight, your nervous system continues sorting chemical traces endlessly, deciding what feels safe, what feels familiar, what deserves emotional weight, while most of the process remains completely invisible from the inside. Chapter 11. Cognitive dissonance. Rarely feels dramatic while it's happening. It feels small. A tightening in the chest during conversation. A strange urge to defend yourself before anyone has actually accused you of anything. The quick instinct to explain away information that arrived a little too close to something you already believe about yourself. Most people imagine dishonesty as deliberate, but the mind often edits reality much more quietly than that. A dinner table is enough to watch it happen. Half-finished plates. Condensation rings beneath water glasses. Someone says something uncomfortable, not aggressive, just inconvenient. a fact that doesn't fit neatly with the version of events everyone has already settled into. The room changes subtly. Forks slow down. Someone laughs too quickly. Another person suddenly becomes very interested in refilling drinks. The nervous system notices contradiction before language fully organizes around it. And the brain dislikes contradiction intensely. Cognitive dissonance is what happens when two incompatible ideas attempt to occupy the mind at the same time. The discomfort can be surprisingly physical. Thoughts tighten. Emotions sharpen. The body begins searching for resolution almost immediately, often before conscious awareness catches up. The strange part is how creatively the brain solves the problem, not always by changing beliefs, often by changing the story around them. Someone buys something expensive they secretly regret, then spends weeks insisting it was absolutely worth the money. A person hurts someone they care about and quietly reconstructs the memory until their behavior feels more justified. Evidence appears challenging a deeply held worldview, and suddenly the source becomes unreliable, suspicious, biased, unfair. The mind protects internal consistency with remarkable determination, sometimes more determination than it protects truth itself. That realization unsettles people because most of us prefer to imagine ourselves as rational observers, moving carefully through reality. But cognition is deeply emotional beneath the surface. Beliefs are tied to identity, relationships, status, belonging, memory. Contradiction threatens more than information. It threatens coherence, and coherence feels psychologically necessary. Researchers studying cognitive dissonance discovered that even small inconsistencies can trigger measurable discomfort. People asked to defend opinions they do not truly believe often begin shifting their private attitudes slightly afterward, just to reduce the tension created by saying the words aloud. Decisions become easier to justify after they are made. Regrets soften through explanation. Contradictions blur through repetition. The brain edits backward. Not constantly, but constantly enough to shape personality. There's something strangely human about how automatic this process becomes. Most people do not consciously announce, "I am now restructuring reality to protect my self-image." The adjustment happens invisibly. Memory changes emphasis. Emotion changes interpretation. Certain details fade while others become strangely important. A person slowly becomes the narrator of a version of events that feels emotionally survivable. And honestly, some degree of this may be necessary. A mind perfectly incapable of smoothing contradiction would likely become overwhelmed very quickly. Human beings make mistakes constantly. We contradict ourselves. We hold incompatible desires simultaneously. We believe things emotionally before proving them logically. The nervous system evolved to maintain functional continuity, not perfect philosophical consistency. The self is partly stitched together through selective editing. That may explain why embarrassment feels so powerful. Public contradiction threatens not only correctness, but identity. Being wrong in front of others creates a uniquely uncomfortable pressure because social belonging depends partly on appearing coherent and trustworthy. The body reacts accordingly. Heart rate shifts, muscles tense, attention narrows. The emotional system treats contradiction almost like a small social injury. which is why arguments often become less about facts and more about emotional survival, without anyone fully noticing the shift happen in real time. Once identity becomes involved, logic alone rarely resolves the tension cleanly. And cognitive dissonance does not only shape beliefs about politics or morality or large philosophical questions. It appears constantly in ordinary life. Relationships especially become filled with tiny unconscious negotiations between reality and emotional comfort. People excuse behavior they would condemn in strangers, ignore warning signs they would notice immediately in someone else's relationship, convince themselves they are happy because admitting otherwise would require rearranging too much of life all at once. The mind bends gently around emotional necessity, sometimes wisely, sometimes dangerously. There's also an eerie continuity between cognitive dissonance and memory itself. The brain does not store experience like a video archive. It reconstructs, reinterprets, updates emotional framing over time, which means the stories people tell themselves about who they are can slowly drift without them recognizing the movement clearly. A person can sincerely believe a revised version of events years later because the nervous system has rehearsed that version repeatedly enough for it to feel emotionally true. Not fabricated. True. That distinction matters, because most self-deception does not feel like deception from the inside. It feels like explanation. And perhaps that is what makes the subject unsettling. The brain's ability to protect emotional continuity is deeply useful, deeply human, and occasionally deeply unreliable all at once. The same machinery helping people survive grief, regret, and uncertainty can also make them resistant to uncomfortable truths long after reality has changed around them. The spilled water at the dinner table eventually gets wiped away. The conversation moves on. Dessert arrives. Someone changes the subject just enough for everyone to breathe normally again. And beneath the ordinary rhythm of the evening, the mind quietly continues editing itself in real time, smoothing contradictions, protecting identities, rearranging emotional furniture slightly so the room inside consciousness feels livable again. Chapter 12. The Cosmic Library. The longer people study the mind, the stranger it becomes. That may be the final thing worth admitting honestly. For centuries, humans have tried to explain consciousness with the confidence of cartographers sketching coastlines they barely survived crossing. First came philosophy, then anatomy, electricity, psychology, brain scans glowing in dark rooms, entire libraries filled with diagrams, theories, measurements, elegant explanations that held together beautifully until the next discovery arrived and quietly bent the map again. And still, after all of it, consciousness remains partially untranslatable. A library late at night feels close to the right atmosphere for it. Tall shelves disappearing upward into shadow. Dust moving slowly through the light of a single lamp left burning after closing time. Half-open books stacked carelessly beside handwritten notes. Entire sections meticulously organized beside others that look abandoned halfway through cataloging. Somewhere deeper in the building, a cartwheel squeaks rhythmically against old tile while someone unseen keeps working long after everyone else has gone home. That is what neuroscience often feels like from the inside. Not ignorance exactly. Ongoing sorting. Researchers have mapped enormous portions of the brain successfully. Regions tied to language, emotion, visual processing, memory formation, motor control. Networks involved in attention, sleep, fear, planning, social behavior. The broad architecture is visible now in ways earlier generations could barely imagine, and yet the deeper questions remain strangely intact. How does electrical activity become subjective experience at all? Why should chemistry produce the feeling of being someone? Where exactly does a thought begin before awareness notices it? Why do memories feel emotionally alive instead of merely stored? Why does consciousness exist from the inside rather than simply functioning mechanically in darkness? The closer science moves toward these questions, the more the edges seem to multiply. That is not failure. It may simply be the nature of studying a system from within itself. The brain is attempting to explain the brain while using the brain to do the explaining. There's something almost recursive about that. Like a library trying to catalog itself while the shelves keep rearranging quietly overnight. And despite all the uncertainty, ordinary life continues running on top of these unanswered questions effortlessly. People still lose keys, fall in love, forget names temporarily, replay embarrassing conversations while brushing their teeth, smell rain and feel childhood returning for reasons they cannot explain. The machinery remains mysterious while the experience stays familiar. That contradiction may be the most human part, because people rarely live according to complete understanding. Most of life is improvised through partial information and emotional approximation. The mind predicts, guesses, patches gaps, revises stories afterward. You walk into rooms and forget why. Make decisions emotionally before explaining them logically. Remember certain moments with painful clarity, while entire years blur together quietly in retrospect. Consciousness feels smooth from the inside because the brain edits aggressively. It removes the seams. But occasionally the edits become visible, a dream lingering too long after waking, a word disappearing mid-sentence, a sudden emotional reaction arriving before explanation, a familiar song reopening a version of yourself you thought had vanished years ago. Those moments reveal the scaffolding briefly. Then the mind closes the curtain again. Modern brain imaging made some of this even stranger rather than simpler. Researchers discovered neural activity, suggesting decisions may begin before conscious awareness reports making them. Emotional reactions appear before explanation. Pattern recognition happens silently beneath attention. Entire networks coordinate constantly outside the narrow spotlight people experience as deliberate thought. The conscious self may be less like a ruler giving commands and more like a narrator arriving slightly late to describe what the rest of the system has already begun doing. And still, despite that unsettling possibility, the experience of being human remains deeply personal. Pain hurts. Nostalgia aches. Loneliness changes the texture of rooms. Love alters memory. Fear reshapes perception. No scan fully captures the feeling of grief at 3 in the morning, or the strange comfort of hearing someone else breathing nearby in the dark. Data measures patterns. Experience measures existence differently. There's also something comforting, hidden inside the unfinishedness of it all. People often assume uncertainty should feel disappointing, but mystery may actually be part of what keeps consciousness emotionally alive. A completely solved mind might feel strangely deadened, flattened into mechanics entirely. Instead, the human brain remains partially unknowable even to itself. A system capable of studying galaxies while still forgetting why it walked into the kitchen. A structure fragile enough to change from lack of sleep, yet powerful enough to invent mathematics, music, stories, cities, religions, memories, entire imagined futures. And somewhere inside all that noise and electrical weather, a continuous sense of I persists stubbornly through the years, despite constant change underneath it. That persistence itself feels slightly miraculous. There is a kind of library hidden inside consciousness, not metaphorically anymore, but emotionally. Shelves filled with unfinished interpretations, memories filed imperfectly, emotional records without dates, entire rooms locked for reasons you no longer remember. Strange fragments resurfacing unexpectedly decades later, because some forgotten part of the mind kept preserving them quietly in darkness. Sometimes you revisit those shelves intentionally. Sometimes the door opens on its own. And perhaps the final strange fact about the human mind is not that it is flawed, biased, emotional, forgetful, or unfinished. It is that despite all of those imperfections, being conscious still feels meaningful. The system leaks,